And I think the person who's one of the most calmest, elegant people is Elahi. You just have such an amazing way about you. So for me, it's always calm in the world when you are around. Even when we're talking about the turmoil in places like Afghanistan and things like that, it's like, we're going to move forward, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Greeting to everyone out there. My name is Elahi Amani. I'm the chair of Women's Intercultural Network. Thank you for joining us from near and far. Today we are thinking of Afghanistan and Haiti and all peoples in our connected struggle. Women's Equality Day, celebrated every August 26, commemorates the passage of women's suffrage in the US and reminds us of the hurdles overcome by the heroic women who faced violence and discrimination to propel the women's movement forward. In the early 19th century, American women who generally couldn't inherit property and made half of a man's wage in any available jobs began organizing to demand political rights and representation. By the early 1900s, several countries, including Finland, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom, has legalized voting for women as the movement continued sweep across the world. In the US, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was first introduced in 1878, but it failed to gain traction. It wasn't until women's involvement in the World War I effort made their contribution painfully obvious that women's suffrage finally gained enough support. Women's rights groups pointed out to the hypocrisy of fighting for democracy in Europe while denying it to the half of the American citizen at home. Because a constitutional amendment requires approval from 2/3 of the state, 36 of them had to ratify the 19th Amendment before its passage. The deciding vote is in the Tennessee's legislature came from Harry T. Byrd, a young state representative whose mother's plea to support the amendment became a deciding factor in his vote, which he switched at the last minute. Women aren't done fighting for equal rights. Today, the wage gap between men and women still impacts women's economic power, and gender-based discrimination still plagued workplaces and business transactions. To remind us of the struggle of the past, present, and future, Congress designated August 26 as Women's Equality Day in 1971. I'm very excited that in today's program of Women's Intercultural Network, which by the way is a signature event of WIN, we have three amazing speakers. First, Zoe Nicholson, ERA expert and activist. Zoe Nicholson is an expert in ERA and activist who demonstrated her commitment to the Equal Rights Amendment with a 37-day fast in 1982 in Springfield, Illinois. Over 40 years later, she has become an Alice Paul Scholar, mentor to equality advocates, student of NVDA, and persistent radical activist. She has been featured in Anchorage Will Meet Again and soon to be released Still Working 9 to 5, her book. The Hungry Heart, a woman's fast for justice in her actual 1982 diary from Illinois' battle for ERA. She is a living library of American women's journey for equality and a captivating storyteller. I'm very proud that she's also living the city that I live in, United States, city of Long Beach. Mary Hansel, she's another panelist for today's, which we have the honor to have her. Mary Hansel is a lecturer, clinical attorney at UC Irvine School of Law, currently serving as acting director of international Justice Clinic. Mary earned her JD at USC Gold School of Law and her LLM at the London School of Economics. She has published and presented widely on international law and human rights issues. Mary has taught both clinical and doctoral courses in international and human rights. As a clinician, she has supervised an array of human rights projects, including advocacy in support of Cedaw ordinance in Los Angeles County. Additionally, Mary has taught a range of doctoral courses in international law, including a course on the use of human rights standards and mechanisms in addressing social justice issues in the US. Prior to academia, she has worked on human rights matters at civil society organizations and consulted for proceedings before High Court of Uganda. Mary is co-editor of Human Rights at Home blog and a member of the Cities for Cedaw Advisory Committee. She recently completed her term as executive committee member of the California State Bar's International Law section. And our third speaker, Elmi Bermejo. She's on WIN Advisory Board member, and she has a passion for building and strengthening relationships while assisting people and organizations attain their goals. She has been a senior government official with more than 25 years of experience at executive level. She has an established successful record of collaboration with public and private stakeholders on a range of issues, including workforce development, disaster relief, and small businesses. Elmi recently served as the Northern California Director of External Affairs of Governor Gavin Newsom. Prior to that, she has served as a senior advisor and outreach director for Lieutenant Governor Eleni Kounalakis. I probably butchered the name of California, the first woman ever elected to this position. In her role, she created the outreach infrastructure, developed and maintained relationships with key leaders, and implemented the field plan, traveling to all California 58 counties and spurring urban and rural grassroots support. Elmi also served in President Barack Obama's administration as the regional representative for the Secretary of Labor in the Western United States. She served on the San Francisco Commission on the Environment, the Women's Foundation of California, and is an advisory member of Hispanics Organized for Political Equality, HOPE, an Alliance for Girls. I'm very pleased to start the event by inviting Zoe to begin sharing her thoughts. Thank you.
Let's see if I can share my screen with everybody. You need to enable me to share my screen.
Charlie, I would appreciate, since you are the host, if you can enable her to.
Yeah, I'm currently disabled.
Charlie?
I'm trying to do that. I saw it before. I will try to get it. I don't know if she can be talking while I try to work.
No, actually, I would like to just start with the screens up.
You want to make Zoe host so she can.
I can make Zoe host.
Excellent. That sounds like a dangerous thing to do, but I will return the power at the appropriate moment.
You should be able to share the screen. Let me see. Host, disable participant sharing.
Yes.
There we go.
Very good.
There it is. Now tell me, can everybody see that?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so glad. You know, this is Alice Paul. And let me start by telling you that I don't have a degree in history. I'm not an attorney. I just made the wild mistake of falling in love with Alice Paul about 45 years ago. And when she was a young woman in her 20s, she loved reading mystery books. She made a commitment that she would never read another mystery book until she got equal rights under the law. And I think she might have like hit me with that wand at some point, because that's exactly how my life has gone. I read absolutely nothing but Alice Paul right now. She was born in New Jersey. She was born into an abolitionist family, Quakers, of course. Her father was a banker. They lived on farmland, though it was a lovely house. She certainly want for nothing. She grew up as a Quaker, which meant that men and women were equal. There may not have been music and dancing, but in her community, the Hicksite Quakers, there was not the gender inequality that her mother experienced when she went to Swarthmore. Her mother had to leave Swarthmore because she married, and married ladies could not continue on in college. Once they were married, they could not stay. But Alice went there and she graduated. She was studying botany and biology, and one of her professors kind of zeroed in on her and thought, you know, you have more in you than to teach biology. And he offered her a year's internship at Rivington House. And you may be familiar with the idea of settlement houses because of Jane Addams. Certainly her settlement house was really famous, but Rivington House is still there. Actually, she spent a year there, and it was a place at the time where Jewish refugees were coming through and Italians were coming through, and they would come to these buildings. They would learn their language, they would learn about food, about customs, they would have people help them find housing. Everything that you and I would think was social work, but there was no such thing at the time as social work. It was called philanthropy. The program she was in eventually became Columbia School of Social Work. And you might find it interesting. I pride myself in knowing something sort of interesting. A takeaway here is that 3 years before she spent her year at Rivington House, a young lady spent a year there named Eleanor Roosevelt. This is where colleges across the country sent young women who wanted to learn more about the relationship we have with immigrants. And the reason why I'm spending some time on this is because I want to share with you, I want you to come away from this moment understanding that this was the birthplace of the Equal Rights Amendment. She was actually serving there. She was watching people come to this country with nothing. And she saw with total clarity that until men and women were equal under the law, until they had full constitutional rights across the entire country, the ability to actually come in as an immigrant and become an equal American would require that all Americans be equal in the founding documents of the Constitution. So I think if you carry that message through, no matter where we go in the next few minutes, you'll understand a whole lot more about what was happening here. Now, she was quiet, dour, studious, and never took her hat off. It was said that if you opened up the door at night in her room, she would be sitting in bed with a bed desk and still have her hat on with her night clothes and her hat. She simply didn't realize she had it on, that the day was moving forward. She was so engaged. And she went to London to do a couple of things. One, to continue her work in settlement houses. And secondly, she went to the London School of Economics, which is where she met leaders from all over the world. And in particular, she met a number of leaders from Japan. And she went on many years later to be instrumental in seeing that women were included in the Japanese Constitution. So she was getting a full taste of the world. And then one day a collision happened in Hyde Park. She met Christabel Pankhurst, was the oldest daughter of Emmeline Pankhurst. And these are the women who were working on equal rights and the vote for women in Great Britain. And she stayed and she got arrested and she went to jail and she was force fed and she did it all. And the whole time her mother is quoted here, which I think is so funny, in the New York Times. Her mother says, "I just don't know what happened to my darling Alice." And it struck me because I can remember my mother reading about me in a magazine during the fast, thinking, "Oh my God, what is my daughter doing?" So there was a little bit of nostalgia there. But there was a moment when Alice took a hard look. It was the meeting in July of, I think it's in 1906, that she heard Mrs. Pankhurst talk about the beginnings of violent action. And she left that day and never went back, because Alice carried on with nonviolent direct action. She found out that there was someone else in that audience, Mahatma Gandhi, who also left that day and never went back. And we know that because both Gandhi and she talked about it, wrote about it. And I think it's an interesting thing for you to carry forward. Now, she worked on the vote for 7 years, but the whole time, all she really was interested in was the Equal Rights Amendment. So what she did, there she is dropping the flag, August 18th, 1920, 36 stars. She sewed them on herself. And she left that building that night because she did not want to bring forward any further expenses on the organization. She knew that the vote was just a simple stone on the road to equality. She left the Women's Party. She had been the leader. And she started work on 3 law degrees. And interestingly, she got a panel of 13 attorneys, and they weren't practicing attorneys because women weren't allowed to do that. They could go to law school, they could get a degree. But as you can see, I think it's over here under the pictures that we're still, my face is probably covering, I'm so sorry to say, the director of her board of 13 that studied the women's laws across all the states, all 36 states, so they could adequately address them. At the conclusion of those 3 years, Alice Paul and this committee of 13 women who were, the one that I have the picture of over there, she had sent her dues in to join the bar and her dues got sent back. She was not allowed to join the bar in Washington, D.C. So they wrote as a committee the Equal Rights Amendment. And this is the birthplace where they finally made it public, and Alice, always being aware of the grandeur and the pageantry that the Pankhursts had taught her to make a big spectacle out of everything. She actually went to Seneca Falls, New York on the anniversary of the introduction of the vote in 1848 in Seneca. On the anniversary of that is the National Women's Party. Alice is standing there in the front. There's a little girl standing in front of her, and she is presenting the Equal Rights Amendment to the world on that day, the anniversary of Seneca. And the next day, she and Anita Pulitzer take it to Susan B. Anthony's grave over here on the left, to tell her that her life now belongs to the Equal Rights Amendment. I don't expect you to be able to read this screen. This screen has a whole different mission. This screen is to tell you that if somebody says, well, nothing happened to the ERA between 1923 and 1977, I want you to understand that the ERA was never at rest. It was introduced to committees, it was voted on by the House, it was voted on by the Senate, it failed, it passed, it went through the motions constantly. Romantically, the man who brought it to the House of Representatives the very first time, he's up there in this news clipping on the upper left, is Susan B. Anthony's nephew, Representative Anthony, introduced the Equal Rights Amendment to Congress. You know, it's just a shame that people don't understand that it never let up for a single moment. And I also know that, and we'll get to it, but the ERA has never been closer in my lifetime than it is today. But in Alice's lifetime, she believed it was going to pass in 1940. There was real belief in 1940 that equality in the Constitution for everyone was going to pass. So imagine she recovered from that disappointment. I keep on thinking about all the disappointments Alice recovered from, and that one being certainly the primary one. So what happened? It went out to the states as in 1972, a group of women had gotten in the balcony, risked arrest, and harassed Birch Bayh from the balcony of the Senate in 1971, demanding that he hold a hearing, and he did. And they voted on it, and it got through the House and the Senate and went out to the states for ratification. And they put a time limit on it. Now, did they put a time limit on the other 22 amendments? No. They put a time limit on the amendments that had to do with women's lives, just like there's a statute of limitations on sexual assault, just like there was an expiration date on processing rape kits. Whenever you see a time limit, I hope you are going to ask yourself, is there a time limit when this applies to men? No, it's just for women. So they put a time limit on, and they marched here on the left. This is actually the Ellis Paul Memorial March on the left that she had died just a month before this march in July of 1977. And they got an extension of 3 years, 3 months. And in 1982, in that time of those 3 years, nothing ever passed, ever. And then something miraculous happened. A majority of women were elected to the Nevada legislature. And mostly because of the work of the woman down here on the bottom left, State Senator Pat Spearman. She had met a woman named Helene who was walking across the country for the Equal Rights Amendment. And Pat Spearman took upon herself getting Nevada to pass, to bring it up and pass it. And that was in 2017. And they passed it, and they signed it, and they sent it to the National Archives. In 2018, Illinois passed it, and they signed it, and they sent it to the archivist, and he published it. And you may know in 2020, Virginia passed it. Well, how did that happen? They got a majority of women in the state legislature, and they passed it, and they sent it to the archivist. And Bill Barr, Attorney General for President 45, wrote a memo that said, do not publish. And that's where it is today. What will the ERA do? I always want to tell you what Alice said. In 1972, Alice was asked, what will the ERA do? And she said, we'll see. Because the fact is, we don't really know. That's not how the Constitution works. Something is brought into the status of an amendment, and then laws push against it. People bring lawsuits to test it, to see how it applies. But at the moment, we know that at the federal level, it will iron out the wage gap, not only between men and women, which is interesting, obviously, but between women and women. Because I'm a white woman and I can make 77 cents, but my Latina sisters can only make 67 cents. We need to seek equality between women as well. It also will remove the gender scales to charge women more, even though they earn less, to pay the same rent as a man, but they are paid less. And we learned that through Lily Ledbetter when she looked at her pension. She was comparing at a retirement party, her pension with a man who had worked side by side with her all those years when they were retiring. And because she got paid less, of course, her SSI was less and her pension was less. What's happening today? What are we trying to do right this minute? We are working to remove the deadline. The House voted in March on HJ 17 and voted to remove the deadline. The Senate has yet to bring it to committee. And I want to tell you that on this coming Saturday, on the steps of the Supreme Court, every women's organization in the United States that works in politics will be standing on the steps of, that can get there, by the way. I want to say poor women can't get there. So I hope there are local things going on. There is here in Long Beach, of course, but some women can't afford to get all the way to Washington, D.C. to protest. But we will be standing in solidarity with them at the Supreme Court to remove the deadline and to remove the Barr memo, because apparently A.G. Garland with the DOJ is doing nothing to counter the tons, the stacks of Barr memos that still control our lives. By the way, all these people standing down here with these individual signs, that is where they're standing. They're standing in front of the DOJ, excuse me, the archivist. They're in the archivist building waiting for the archivist to publish it. I want to recommend that you take a picture of this with your phone. These are sources I recommend. These are the latest books I've read on it this year that I thought were really exciting. 2 films I do recommend, Equal Means Equal, and the forthcoming Still Working 9 to 5. If you just click that with your phone. What can you do? Another time you should click your phone and look at this, write the archivist, write the president. It is in the Democratic platform to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. So there's plenty we can do. And this is the poster for the event on Saturday, the national event. And if you're local to Southern California, we're having an event here. Thank you very much for allowing me this time to talk about the Equal Rights Amendment.
Thank you very much, Zoe. Wonderful, wonderful presentation. Now we're going to hear from Mary Hansel about Cedaw.
Yeah, hi, can everyone hear me? Okay, great. Thank you so much for that introduction and for including me in this important and timely panel. I'm learning so much already and we're just getting started. So I thought I'd start off by situating and giving some context for Cedaw and the Cities for Cedaw movement within the broader international human rights landscape. And then briefly address some differences between Cedaw and the ERA, with the ultimate understanding that I'm in favor of ratifying both of them. Cedaw, which is the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, it's a mouthful, was adopted by the UN in 1979 and went into effect in 1981. It's often referred to as the International Bill of Rights for Women, and it's really the authoritative global legal instrument on gender equity. It's also one of 9 core global human rights treaties. So of these 9, by the way, the US has ratified 3 of them. That's the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Convention Against Torture, and the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So Cedaw is the 2nd most ratified global treaty. It's ratified by all but 6 countries, and the US, of course, is one of those 6. Just sidebar, as we say in law, the most ratified treaty is the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and that has been ratified by every country except 1, and that's, of course, the US. For years, it was the US and Somalia, and then a couple of years ago, Somalia decided to do the right thing. So sorry for my, to be legalistic a bit, but just quick poli-sci legal refresher. So to become a party to a treaty, the government needs to both sign and ratify that treaty. President Carter has actually signed Cedaw, and he did so while he was in office, of course, but decades later, we still haven't ratified it. Under the US Constitution, 2/3 of the Senate needs to vote to ratify a treaty, and that means that you need a bipartisan vote, which of course has gotten harder and harder to secure. So there have been 3 ratification attempts in the Senate since Carter signed the treaty. If you read the ratification debates, you'll see a strong sense of American exceptionalism, the idea that the US doesn't need the treaty because we're just so advanced in our gender equity, we have no room for improvement. And of course, we certainly don't need to be told what to do by a UN body, right? So Cedaw remains signed, but not ratified in the US. By the way, another legal note, there is legal significance to signing a treaty and not ratifying it. The Vienna Convention on Treaties provides that when a country signs but fails to ratify a treaty, that country is prohibited from taking any action that would violate the object and purpose of the treaty. The object and purpose of Cedaw, according to the UN committee that oversees the treaty, which I'll talk about in a minute, the object and purpose is to eliminate all forms of discrimination against women with a view to achieving substantive equality. So technically, even though it hasn't ratified Cedaw, the US cannot take any action that is antithetical to eliminating discrimination and achieving substantive equality, but absent ratification, we're not required to implement Cedaw's actual provisions. Okay. A little legal rabbit hole there. So which brings me to Cities for Cedaw. And Cities for Cedaw was created as, I think, a really ingenious end run around the failure of the Senate to ratify Cedaw and implement the treaty directly into local laws. I'll defer to the experts, my fellow panelists, to say more about the history and nitty-gritty of this movement. But I do want to point out that even if the US does ratify Cedaw, we will still likely need this movement to promote local implementation. And this is because when the US ratifies human rights treaties, it attaches what are called RUDs, which is an acronym that means Reservation, Understanding, and Declaration. And these RUDs are sort of caveats, qualifications that a country makes when ratifying a treaty. And the US's favorite RUD is called a non-self-executing reservation. So basically, when we ratify a treaty, we put in a little statement that says, yeah, this doesn't actually apply to us unless Congress takes further action, which it hasn't with respect to the other core treaties. So if nothing else, I hope I'm destroying any image that the audience has of as US as a paragon of human rights, because our ratification record is not great, and we do attach these defeatist RUDs when we do ratify. So there's no reason to think that the US would not attach this same non-self-executing RUD if it ratified Cedaw. Therefore, we would still need a movement within the country to affect implementation. So moreover, the thing I love about the Cities for Cedaw movement is that it's grassroots and it's focused on local implementation. And international human rights is often thought of as something that applies elsewhere, abroad, maybe in the global South. And then if it applies to the US at all, it just applies to the federal level, right? Like that's what we think of when we think of international human rights. But in fact, local implementation is the key to real world change, and international human rights has always been meant to be applied locally. So, even if the UN takes some action or an advocate gets a favorable human rights decision from a human rights court, it doesn't matter until it's implemented in our own backyards, right? So it's always at the local where the rubber hits the road with human rights. And, this reminds me of my favorite Eleanor Roosevelt quote, just to follow up Zoe's mention of Eleanor. She once observed, "Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places close to home. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. Without concerted citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world." I think that nicely encapsulates the spirit of Cities for Cedaw for me. So what's in the substance of Cedaw and why do we need it, especially if the US ends up adopting the ERA? I want to mention that I'm actually writing an article on this and my research is just beginning. So I don't have an exhaustive list for you just yet. And obviously this is a big question and I only have 6 more minutes by my count. So, but I do want to make a few points that I think are important to keep in mind. First, the substance of Cedaw is not limited to the text of the treaty, just like the substance of the Constitution is not limited to the text of that document, right? It needs to be interpreted and applied by by various branches of government. So Cedaw is overseen by a UN committee comprised of 23 experts on gender equity from across the globe. And this committee applies and interprets the treaty, thereby fleshing out the meaning of the treaty's text. The committee issues, I don't know if I want to get into this too far, but the committee issues general interpretive guidance. It also evaluates each country's compliance with the treaty every 4 years. And it even acts as a quasi-judicial body, such that individuals in countries can bring actual complaints, can litigate based on Cedaw. So it creates jurisprudence. So a related point is that despite the fact that Cedaw was drafted decades ago, and if you look at the plain text of the treaty, it may seem anachronistic, out of date, and inapplicable to our current gender equity discourse, the treaty keeps pace with progressive notions of gender equity through the Cedaw Committee's interpretive guidance and jurisprudence. So it's very much like a living body of law. So, the committee has addressed timely issues such as challenges facing LGBTQIA communities, protections for migrant women, including trafficking survivors, sexual assault and harassment, access to comprehensive health care, including reproductive care, the gender dimensions of climate change. It just issued really important guidance in that regard. Online safety challenges. So Cedaw really maintains its relevance to evolving gender equity ideals. And I think, therefore, it has something to offer all types of jurisdictions within the US. So another thing I want to mention is that as for the substance of the ERA, I just want to echo what Zoe said about that, which is even from a legal perspective, it's, the substance is really uncertain and it's largely dependent on how Congress and the courts are going to decide to interpret the amendment. I think there's no doubt that regardless of how it's applied and interpreted, there's tremendous normative impact from ratifying the ERA. It really underscores the importance of condemning gender discrimination within the US. So it's important just from that front alone, but it's really going to be sort of a new battleground once, after ratification in terms of how that plays out in concrete ways. So just to echo Alice Paul's "we will see" quote, which I love. So another thing I want to point out is that even though, the ERA in substance might be a bit of an unknown, at this point, there are a few identifiable ways in which the ERA and Cedaw diverge. The first is intersectionality. So one of the most important aspects of Cedaw is its focus on intersectionality. Cedaw, takes into account how race, age, national origin, class, religion, immigration status, disability, gender identity, sexual orientation, and a multitude of other factors lead to certain groups being disadvantaged in unique ways with compound effects. That has trouble mapping on to our domestic legal scheme. So it's just trickier with the ERA as to how we're going to make sure that the ERA is interpreted in an intersectional way. I'm trying to, again, stay out of legal rabbit holes, but that's the gist of it. So, but Cedaw, it's a little easier just in terms of the structure of the treaty. The other thing I want to mention is that in general, and this is true of all sort of human rights treaties vis-a-vis US domestic law, there are more robust, proactive obligations on governments. So the US would be called upon to do more. So under Cedaw than the ERA, I would predict, because when implementing a human rights treaty, the government needs to respect the rights. So that means refrain from doing anything that would interfere with those rights, protect the rights, which means making sure people's rights are protected from interference from third parties, such as the private sector or individuals who might harm them. And then thirdly, governments are called upon to fulfill the conditions necessary for people to enjoy their rights. And that's quite a proactive obligation. That's, under how the courts have interpreted rights in the US, that's just not true of obligations in the US. So in that way, like each right is a bit more like comprehensive and calls upon the government to do more. And then finally, and this is sort of related, Cedaw focuses on substantive equality. We call it de facto equality versus de jure equality. And the difference there is the difference between treating people in different situations in a way that leads to equitable outcomes, which is kind of what Cedaw does and other human rights treaties, versus treating everyone equally and ending up with different outcomes, right? So you can treat everyone the same, but you're not going to get equal outcomes. And that's not substantive equality, but that's often the approach of a lot of US laws. So it's different in that way. So those are just some general ways, a bit abstract, about how Cedaw and ERA differ, but I hope to have more concrete ways as my research progresses. The other thing I want to point out, how am I on time? I have 11 seconds. So another thing I want to point out is that a poli-sci professor at Pomona recently did a study comparing LA's Cedaw for Cities ordinance and San Francisco's with the substance of Cedaw, meaning like the interpretive guidance set forth by the Cedaw committee. And she found that while great strides have been made by these local ordinances, they're different qualitatively than the substance of the treaty. And I mean, you could sort of figure that out just by looking at the text of each. But I would love to see that I would love to see local ordinances start to engage more with the substance of the actual treaty and its jurisprudence and interpretive guidance. And I'm trying to get a provision in to this effect with LA County, but we have this group of global gender equity experts weighing in on this. Like, why would we not, consider that in our local implementation and, learn from other countries and, other parties to Cedaw. So I would and to end with a plug, I would love to see that happen more and more with local measures. So thanks very much. I'm definitely out of time.
Thank you very much, Mary. Excellent presentation. As much as I've been following Cedaw since for more than 3 decades, you always presented with new information. So I appreciate it very much. Thank you. And now we're gonna hear Jamie Bermejo, that she's also been part of the journey of Cities for Cedaw as part of WIN board and advisory board, and I'm sure she's gonna unpack how this campaign was started at UN and everything else. Thank you, Jamie. Elmi, I'm sorry, Elmi. You're on mute, Elmi.
All those technical things we keep having to be reminded of. Thank you so much, Elahe, and thank you, Zoe Nicholson and Mary Hansel. What an honor to be with you on this panel today. And also, thank you for WIN and the Iranian Circle of WIN and the Susquehanna Intertribe Council for putting this together today. There's so much information, and I think it's important to note that things are always evolving. What Mary just mentioned about how to look at local ordinances is something that I think could be also mentioned. And there's a toolkit on how to do a city for Cedaw on the website. So as you've heard about, when we talk about women's equality, and that the fight for women's equality is never ending. And especially in recent events in Afghanistan with the takeover of the Taliban, it reminds us that we just can never let our guard down. Even when we are thinking we are making strides and we've gained something, we always have to be mindful to preserve that, to make sure that we continue to talk about doing more and how do we engage more people in that struggle for women's equality. And while we are horrified and we can be in despair about the recent events in Afghanistan, we can't allow that to paralyze us, which is why I think today's conversation is very important. As you heard, Cedaw, the Convention to Eliminate All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, is an international treaty adopted by the UN in 1979 and has yet to be ratified by the US Senate. And you've also heard about the definition, but Cedaw also provides a practical blueprint to promote human rights and to open opportunities for women and girls in all areas of society. And the treaty calls for each ratifying country to overcome barriers to discrimination in the political, social, economic, and cultural fields. And that includes addressing issues of domestic violence, human trafficking, affordable healthcare, childcare, economic security, pay inequities, paid family leave, educational and vocational opportunities. The empowerment of women is very central to building a democratic and peaceful and prosperous society. Cedaw strengthens the United States as a global leader in standing up for equality for women and girls around the world. Under the leaderships, there have been other treaties that were ratified under President Bush, Clinton, Reagan that had to do with torture, race, genocide. And, we still don't have Cedaw ratified in the United States. The World Bank did a study that provided some documentation on the important role that women play when it released its 2012 World Development Report called Gender Equality and Development. And according to the report, quote, Cedaw has improved women's literacy levels, labor force participation rates, parliamentary representations, and in some cases has reduced the absolute gender inequalities. In countries that have ratified Cedaw, women have partnered with their governments to engage in a national dialogue and has shaped the policies of equality for women and girls. And as a result of that, have changed, there's been greater safety and opportunity for women and their families. But as we talk about the Cities for Cedaw campaign, how do you engage and create a movement and engage people about city? And that's when we talk about bringing the global local, which is so much of the focus of what the Women's Intercultural Network has done. The Cities for Cedaw campaign started out as a grassroots effort. And I have a quote, Margaret Mead once said that never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. And I think when we talk about grassroots movements and grassroots efforts, we look at those entities that can provide tools and leadership to empower local women's organizations and municipalities. And in many cities, as you've heard, have initiated Cedaw within their city, county, or state. Civil society campaigns led by the Women's Intercultural Network. And I thank Marilyn Fowler, who has been a big champion of Cedaw, and she has been actually got me involved many, many years ago when I was working for the state legislature. WIN has consultative status with the United Nations and usually takes a delegation every year, except under COVID, to the United Nations for the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women convening usually in March. So the mission of WIN has been to ensure that all women and girls are represented and have a vote in their government, a voice in the economy and civil society. And it was also started with this as a grassroots campaign in partnership with the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, the Leadership Conference Education Fund. And thank you, June Zeitlin, for that. And the NGO Committee on the Status of Women in New York. The aim of Cities for Cedaw, the convention, again, to eliminate all forms of discrimination against women campaign, is to make it, as I said previously, the global local and protect the rights of women and girls by passing legislation establishing the principles of Cedaw in cities and towns across the United States. And one of those examples is my city of San Francisco, where in 1998, San Francisco became the first city in the United States to adopt an ordinance reflecting the principles of Cedaw to improve the lives of women and girls. Since its adoption, San Francisco has developed new initiatives on domestic violence, homicide, human trafficking, family-friendly workplaces, and expanded language access for responders to domestic violence. And Krishanti Dharmaraj was one of the early architects of that. She was living in San Francisco and was also a member of the Commission on the Status of Women. So we have 1998, and then between 1998 and 2014, many cities and including states, Hawaii, Berkeley, adopted Cedaw. In March 2014, the NGO, the CSW in New York, launched Cities for Cedaw campaign and asked then Mayor Ed Lee in San Francisco to be a peer leader for the Cities for Cedaw USA campaign. And the city requested that the Women's Intercultural Network, WIN, be the civil society counterpart to that. In June of 2014, more than 200 mayors at the US National Conference of Mayors adopted a general resolution in support of Cedaw, followed by another resolution in 2015. And as was mentioned, Mayor Garcetti in August 2015 issued an executive directive on Cedaw, which was an innovative way to use a mayoral power. Since September 2015, Miami-Dade County in Florida is the first county to actually continue with the ordinance. And what has happened as a result of that? So I wanted to go over 10 of the achievements in the time that we have to talk about what that meant for San Francisco to have Cedaw and to use the principles and how the city is governed. So there are 10 things that I'm going to, I have listed. And one is that for 40 months without domestic violence homicide, a cross-agency approach to domestic violence response led to a record 44 months without a single domestic violence homicide from 2011 to 2014. Number 2, Gender Equality Principles Initiative. 7, Gender Equality Principles ranging from employment and compensation to supply chain practices to support more productively workplaces. Number 3, develop proper police codes, collaboration between the department on the status of women. It's important to note that in San Francisco, it's not just a commission, it's an actual department on the status of women. And law enforcement agencies adopted new codes for domestic violence, stalking, child abuse, and elder abuse. It expanded language access, trained 150 emergency personnel in basic Chinese and Spanish phrases for responding to domestic violence, and partnered with local foundations to provide cell phones to access 170 languages at crime scenes. Number 5 was the Family Violence Council that addressed family violence across lifespan by bringing together advocates working against child abuse, domestic violence, and proposed policy reforms to improve criminal justice and social service responders to family violence. Number 6 was the San Francisco Collaborative Against Human Trafficking, which is still very active today. And that is a coalition of community-based organizations and government agencies to look at the eradication and elimination of modern-day slavery. Number 7, there was a mayor's task force on human trafficking, a holistic effort staffed by the Department on the Status of Women with participation from law enforcement, public health, child welfare, the school districts, and community-based organizations that work with trafficking survivors. At that time, now Governor Newsom was the mayor of San Francisco at that time, and he's one of the founders of this task force. Number 8 was the gender analysis of city agencies, which is very important. Government agencies examine their workforce, programs, and budgets to ensure that they are non-discriminatory and fully serve all communities of women and girls. 10 city agencies at that time had undergone such analysis. And that's another important thing, having the data. Number 9 was the Violence Against Women Prevention and Intervention Crisis Grant Program that the Department on the Status of Women distributed anti-violence grants totaling $4.6 million at the time to 31 community-based organizations. So again, making a difference locally. Number 10 was the Family Friendly Workplaces Ordinance. Working parents and caregivers have the right to request flexible or predictable work schedule without fear of retaliation. So you think, well, what are some of the challenges when we think about, yes, these were successful programs. As we move forward, what are the stumbling blocks? And some of that is among the challenges identified by the campaign were poor knowledge by city officials and the public about Cedaw. And so it's important to have people to talk about that. What is it? Maybe we need to do a better job of talking to our local leaders about those things. The lack of baseline data, no funding for organizations that the campaign or implementations within city budgets. So that also has to be part of the conversation. The lack of research. And so we thank Mary for the legal expertise, because that is also something that was missing in the past. And then what about, there were limited training possibilities. And, sometimes when you have cities that are experiencing, or the economy has a turn on, there's a downturn in the economy, a lot of times these kinds of programs are the first to go. So we have to also make sure that we have voices, whether there are voices in city government, in commissions, to make sure that we remind people the importance of that. And so that's for the Cities for Cedaw campaign. And there is, I think San Francisco serves as a good blueprint. We talked about Los Angeles and other cities, taking what works for one city that may not work for another city. So these are really important conversations to have. And I think it was also very important when we convened in New York during the 2 weeks in March for the UN Commission on Women to exchange ideas, because we would come together, many of the cities, there was always a group of Cities for Cedaw that convened. We would have meetings. Emily Morase from San Francisco is a big part of that as well. And exchanging ideas, what's working for your city, what's not working for your city. I also believe that as we move forward, electing more women to public office is also very important. It is important to have all sorts of allies. We certainly have male allies, but the idea of having women in public office in commissions is also very important. And I know I'm about time, and I want to make sure that we leave enough time for questions and answers, and happy to answer any questions after the presentations. But I think I welcome the opportunity to talk to you about this today. Elahi, thank you for the invitation. There's just so much work to be done. And over the years, I've had the opportunity to travel to Haiti and talk about the importance of women in public service in Haiti, in Salvador, and in Bolivia. And it's something that we have to continue to do, and to remind people that we can't just sort of, it's not somebody else's job. We all have to do this together and bring other people along in the struggle to make sure that we continue the path for women's equality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Elmi. Excellent presentation of the journey that Cities for Cedaw had gone through all these years. Now we can open for Q&A. We have about 15 minutes, 16 minutes to be exact, for Q&A. And while you are writing your question, I want to share, as Afghanistan is in our mind today, in 2001, a delegation from Women's Intercultural Network, we went to Afghanistan, we went to Kabul, and I knew through the UN agencies that in 2001, after ousting Taliban from power, Afghanistan signed Cedaw and ratified Cedaw. So I took a Farsi translation of Cedaw to Afghanistan and did a workshop on how to implement Cedaw in Farsi, in Persian. So it's really heartbreaking to see after 20 years, we're now going back to point zero in Afghanistan. But many Afghan women NGOs and activists that they are part of Afghan Circle of Women's Intercultural Network, and we've been in contact with some of them. They are moving forward and organizing for holding on to what they gained during the last 20 years. So it's open for Q&A, and any question we have? Okay. Gail James, she's amazing board member of WIN and a Cedaw expert in organizing, and she's we publish by her effort a report on Cedaw, national report on Cedaw. She said, we know that Afghanistan is a signatory of Cedaw since 2003. What leverage do UN and Cedaw Commission have for oversight and to demand compliance with human rights? I guess this question is for everybody, but maybe Mary, as a legal expert, can respond to it.
Yeah, sure. A very important question right now. So as you noted, the sorry, it's really weird to answer a question when I can't see Gail, but as you noted, Afghanistan is a party to Cedaw. The Taliban taking over the state raises important unsettled questions about who's in charge, right? Like, because on the one hand, you don't want to accept that they are a legitimate government, or at least I think many people don't want to do. But then if you're imposing responsibilities on them vis-a-vis women in Afghanistan, you're sort of like ratifying their existence as a legitimate government. So there's just that issue sort of waiting to be sussed out. It's true that they're party to Cedaw, but in order, okay, so they're going to be reviewed every 4 years. So there's that, right? And when a state is reviewed for its compliance with the treaty, civil society organizations from all over the world can submit what are called shadow reports, saying this is what's going on in the country. You need to do something about this. This isn't getting enough attention. Here's some important information. And it helps the Cedaw committee make informed decisions about what the country is doing right and wrong with respect to the underlying treaty. So there's that. I don't actually know when the next 4-year cycle, when Afghanistan is up for review next, but that's a frustratingly kind of long process, right? To wait 4 years. So, and that's one of the frustrating things about international human rights, right? It's very slow moving. So you could bring a kind of a litigation against Afghanistan. However, Afghanistan has not ratified the separate sort of subsidiary treaty of Cedaw, which is called its optional protocol, which a state needs to do in order for an individual in that state to litigate against the state. So that's not an option, unfortunately, because Afghanistan hasn't ratified that optional protocol. So in terms of like what can be done now, the options are not wonderful. The Security Council is meeting right now, right? That's the primary organ of the UN that takes, that is the only body that can authorize any type of use of force in the global sphere. So they're meeting and they might decide to do something, but their main purpose is not to protect human rights. The Human Rights Council, which is a subsidiary body of the General Assembly, sorry, I'm getting into like legal stuff again. They can do something. They'll definitely issue some resolutions and such, but you know, there's no enforcement, right? The only way to get any sort of enforcement is to go through the Security Council, and we'll see if they actually decide to do something. I think they're sort of in a wait and see posture right now, like how bad is this going to get? So those are the sort of terrible options that we have at the international level.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you. I think there is a question for Elmi. Elmi, what are the possibilities of governor approving cities for Cedaw at the state level?
I believe it was passed, it was passed in California, and hopefully all goes well after the recall and we can have a more richer conversation about that. But I know that there's a Commission on the Status of Women. First partner, Jennifer Siebel-Newsom, is very committed to equality. And I certainly think that I'm happy to work with folks on that. I think that that's an excellent question, and we need to be a leader in that, especially in California.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There's another question. When is it's important to use the word equality and when it's better to use the word equity? And I know that at Beijing Women Conference, there was a rather huge discussion on quality versus equity. So I guess this question for all three of you, whoever want to respond. Mary, you want to provide the legal?
Yes.
I don't think there's like a legal distinction there that I'm aware of. In my mind, equity seems like a more robust concept, and one that sort of reflects the robustness of Cedaw obligations, whereas equality to me sounds more like the sort of equal treatment that I referenced, right? Like treating everyone equally rather than treating them differently and getting equal outcomes. But that is just kind of the sense I have. I don't have like strong objections to the word equality. I use equity though, but I'd love to hear other people's thoughts.
Zoe?
I've learned, since I am a member of several minority groups, I'm also lesbian, that I try to use both all the time. And that is my hint to everybody who's listening, because they have very different applications. And I just picture you and I have a table and we have 10 kids who are having dinner and we're giving everybody the same mac and cheese and pizza and the same size, the same amount, the same sugar, the same salt, the same everything. That's equality. That's probably not going to work out for all 10 kids. Equity is finding out what the needs of each of those 10 kids are and what are they willing to eat that meet those needs, So I want to offer to you the safe place, which is to say both, because they're equally important.
Elmi, any thoughts from you?
I just think that that's a wonderful diplomatic way to say it and to include both words. And I think that I have thought about that sometimes, because when we talk about like Hispanas Organized for Political Equality, you know, I think maybe sometimes we don't really think about that. And now I think there's more thought about that. And I try to say, some people say equity, equality. So I'll use both and so that we can include more folks. But I like, you know, what Zoe said about that, using both words is a good way to go.
Yeah, I remember at the Beijing Women Conference, as the platform for action was being discussed, there was a huge debate on using the terminology of equality versus equity. And finally, the human rights advocates pushed the agenda of equality in the body of the Beijing platform for action, because equity, and the argument was that equity is not measurable. And mostly that was presented by human rights advocate of the Africa, Asia, and Latin American to use the terminology of equality. But like as Zoe and Elmi and mentioned, I also use equity and equality both to cover all aspects of this debate and what it means for different people. But there are some documents online explaining the discussion at the UN Fourth International UN Women Conference at the Beijing. So there is another question. What are the state's ratification implementations? June Mary asked this question to all three panelists, but what are the state ratification implications? So if a state of California ratify, I know we have a resolution at the state level, but what are the ratification implications?
I'm afraid I don't know that.
ERA. Cedaw?
On Cedaw. That's my understanding, that she's referring to Cedaw. How would it be implemented?
Sorry, Elmi.
That is a very good question. I mean, I think if you look at the way some cities have implemented it, where do you start, right? And in San Francisco, it was about gathering data. How are departments doing things? Because you could control that, or at least get buy-in. You have to get buy-in from folks who say, okay, you're right, we need to look at these things so we're not leaving out. And if we believe that this has been passed by our city government, that we should look into it. So I'm not exactly sure what the plan would be, but that's, I would imagine that we need to provide studies, data, and perhaps the first would be to not only pass it, but to have some money attached to it so that there could be a study or a way to implement that. Because so many times legislation is passed, but there's no money to make it a reality. And in San Francisco, for instance, there was the agreement. Yes, we're going to look at city departments, and city departments said, okay, well, since it was in the beginning, okay, we'll cooperate and work with you on this. So I think there's got to be a lot of outreach, a lot of education to even get to that point, so people understand what it is and what. And I honestly believe that when you're talking to people about making sure that everybody, that there's a fair share, there's equality, there's equity. Even the staunchest person has a mom, who the staunchest opponent has a mother, has a wife, has a daughter, and wants them to thrive. So, but I do think that there's needs to be a lot of education, and any passage or anything like that would need to have some funding attached to it to educate not only the people, but also educating the legislators. And so there's got to be a lot of education even before that, and in public hearings. And I think that when I was chair of the California Commission on the Status of Women, we had convening authority. We convened hearings in different parts of the state to ask women in their communities, what are the issues that are impacting you? What is it that the state can do for you? And many people just came to say, I can't believe a state entity really cares about what I think or what needs to happen in my community. And I think those are things that we can start to do with the commission and other organizations that are committed to equity and to equality.
Thank you very much. I think we're at the end of the program. I just want to share with everybody that Women's Intercultural Network and Friends of Commission on the Status of Women in San Francisco, we have quarterly meeting on Cedar. And if you're interested to participate, please add your email in the chat, and we included, we send the email to you for our next quarterly meeting on Cedar. And also stay in touch with us with our Facebook and Instagram, and check our website. Thank you very much for attending, and thank you to the wonderful panelists, Zoe Nicholson, Mary Hansel, and Elmi Bermejo. Thank you very much. It was a very, very good discussion, and appreciate all your effort.